Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading, and then we examine a single relevant question that passage points us to. Today I'm joined by Sheryl, Daughety, and we're looking at a passage from Genesis 45. This story kind of reaches its apex, so Joseph can't contain himself any longer, and he tells his brothers who he really is. He sends everyone outside of the room except his brothers, and he weeps so loudly that those out of the room can hear him. Amidst all of his tears, he finally says the words, "I am Joseph." And his brothers are stunned. Needless to say, I would be as well. But his next words are even more incredible, not only to them, but also to us who read this text today. He says, "Don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. God has sent me ahead of you to keep you and your families alive and to preserve many survivors. So it was God who sent me here, not you." It's kind of amazing that Joseph is able to recognize the hand of God even in the most painful experiences of his life, including the rejection and the hurt by his brothers. So what this does, this perspective that he has, is it robbed the past of its power to offend him. This isn't Joseph glossing over the hurtful actions of his brother. Rather, it's a demonstration of submission to God. By seeing God as the sender and his brothers as the means, Joseph is in fact submitting to the will of God and the greater purpose behind his suffering. Submission to God's purpose for our suffering cannot coexist with being offended over past wrongs. It enabled Joseph to forgive. When people hurt us, there is often a sense of debt that we experience. We feel as if others owe us for what they have done against us. But when we recognize that God has purpose, even for the hurt we have experienced, it allows us to cancel the sense of debt that we have against our offenders and release them. It allowed them to discuss the past without being resentful about it. Forgiveness and releasing others from offense does not mean that issues of the past do not need to be addressed. Seeing the hand of God behind past offenses allows us to discuss those actions and issues without feeling bitterness and resentfulness. It allows us to bring a resolution to past hurts and move on to healing. So I said yesterday, Sheryl, we're more likely to be his brothers than we are Joseph. None of us are him, because he's this key player in the entire piece of scripture, specifically in the survival of the nation of Israel. But how can we adopt his perspective on past hurts? Even though we may not feel like we're that big of a cog in the chain, right? But how does that help us changing our perspective on how people have hurt us?
Well, I have a couple of things to say about that before I might actually answer the question.
Okay.
One thing would be that I don't know that we can ever assume that we're not that big of a cog in the
Right.
chain.
Mm-hmm.
I think we all underestimate the ways in which God can use us if we are willing to do a lot of the things that Joseph did in his life. One of those things being forgiving when maybe people don't deserve it. And you think about how differently everything would have turned out had he decided when they showed up, this is my perfect chance to get revenge. They would not have come as a nation to live there and multiply. And so the Israelites most likely would not have become the nation that they did.
Right.
Which you talked about earlier with Abraham's original promise from God. So those are the two things I wanted to say about that, because I just feel like we can't ever
assume we're not.
Yes.
Right.
Do you think he felt like he was at the time?
I don't think I think he knew in that moment that he played a role in his family's survival.
Sure.
But I don't know that he could see beyond that.
Right. And he certainly had ended up in situations he would never have chosen for himself. It would have never been his original plan.
Right.
For himself. Yeah. But going back to your question about basically how to handle past offenses that way, I would like to think that he may have handled things this way, and I know this is something that really helps me, which is I think it really helps for us to be able to see it from a perspective when somebody hurts you like that or has offended you in such a terrible way. It is often not personally toward you.
Mm-hmm.
You are often the person that just happened to be standing in the space. And I think that it more often, and again, it's hard to have this perspective, but it really does seem to be more often about the person who does the offending than it is about the person who gets offended.
I would say most of the time you're right. Not all of the time.
Not all
Most
of
of
the
the
time, but I
you're
do
right.
feel like a majority of the time that's true.
I would say one of our biggest problems in general is that we take on offense that is not ours to take on, right? Somebody did this to this person, or at least that's what we perceive, and we're all distressed about it, and feel like we have to choose sides. That's one of the things I tell people about divorce when people go silent. That's the number one experience of divorcees is they feel like they lose all of their friends, or a big majority of them.
Uh-huh.
And my experience is when they either people choose a side or they go silent because they don't want to choose a side, which creates problems either way. But we feel like when somebody's offended, somebody else is offended, and then we take personal offense to it. We feel like we have to choose a side in the battle when sometimes we don't. Like, I don't like it when your feelings are hurt. If somebody deliberately comes against you, but I'm not going to walk around with it on my shoulder all the
Right.
time,
Yeah.
And sometimes you do have to see the bigger picture. And I think seeing the bigger picture is a real challenge for most people. For the fact that he was able to see God saved my family, God put me in place with wisdom to save this nation, and I think that's probably as far as he could see, right? But even when we overreact to an offense, over respond to an offense, overreact, whatever the right word, we often do more harm than we do good.
I
I don't.
agree with that.
I have hurt people in my reaction to somebody else's hurt toward me.
I'm sure we all have.
Do you have a process you go through to change your perspective?
I would say that's the number one. And I think that comes fairly naturally to me because I don't process things emotionally. Usually it's more from a more logical point of view, I think, because I want to make sense of things. I don't want to think about how I feel about them. I'm going to process that eventually, but I usually want to make sense of things first in order to process it. And I usually come to the conclusion that if I've been hurt in a situation, it's less about me and more about the person who did the hurting. And I don't mean it like I'm blaming it on them so much as that if you really sit and think about whatever it is that they threw your way, it's usually coming from a hurt that they haven't known how to address or get rid of, or something they haven't been able to forgive that has then kind of become your problem too.
Yeah. Hurt people.
Yeah.
Right. Misery loves company. There's a lot of ways you can say it. And often those people are responding out of hurt. And the question though becomes then, why can't people seem to move on? Because Joseph may have been in prison 12, 13, 15, 17 years. We don't know. It was a long period of time. And occasionally I'll talk to people who are, if you talk to them long enough, there is a subject of whatever theirs is that has wounded them 5 years ago, 10 years ago, sometimes 30 years ago. And it's going to come out, it's going to come bubbling out in almost every conversation in some way. Why do people struggle to heal, move on, deal with?
I believe that when people get hurt in a way that they are hurt so badly they feel they can't let go of it, I really believe it all comes back to trusting God, because I think that we can convince ourselves, well, if God really loved me, then this thing would have never happened. If he was really watching over me, if he was really providing for me and protecting me, then this thing that I feel like has devastated me that I can't let go of would have never happened. And so we begin to feel that we have to protect ourselves.
Right.
And when we begin to protect ourselves, it means that we're losing our trust in him. And we protect ourselves continually after that. And most of the time that means by not letting it happen again, or by not letting that person back into our lives. It feels much more protective for you not to forgive them and give them the chance to do it to you again than it does for you to decide that you want restoration and relationship and trust again, the way that Joseph decided he wanted that with his family, over deciding, like, this is an offense I should never ever forgive you for. How could you have done this to me? As far as you knew, they drug me off when I was dead.
Yeah, even when restoration isn't possible. Let's say it was.
And I'm not saying it always is.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are some times it would just not be possible.
Mhm.
A divorce and people remarry.
Right.
Those kind of restoration situations are complicated. That should be the goal
Mhm.
of all Christians, restoration. Um, I hear people say, the Bible requires me to forgive. It doesn't require me to restore the relationship. And they are right. But I hear that a lot in the context of, I don't want to do the work to it, even try.
Right. Yeah.
And I recognize that there are a lot of past hurts. It could be abuse. It could be physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, whatever the abuse is. There could be broken trust. I mean, there's lots of issues. Why we continue to dwell on them is, I don't know why people can't see the harm that it does to them currently.
Right.
Because I'm right now as I'm talking, I'm thinking of 3 or 4 particular instances of people that I know that if you talk to them, something that happened a long time ago. When I say a long time ago, I mean 20 plus years ago. It's going to come bubbling out.
Inevitably.
Right. It's going to come bubbling out. And after a while, what I see is people get tired of hearing it, right? And they move on from them, and it makes them bitter. That person that is rehashing this all the time, they're bitter and angry and don't realize it. And it's disturbing, and maybe that is the right perspective. They just don't trust God enough to move on. They feel like holding on to it gives them a little bit of power.
And it continually reminds them not to let anybody else do that to them again.
Right.
You're refusing to ever put yourself back in another situation like that where you could get hurt that way again.
Well, the only way to love somebody is to risk being hurt.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is. And if you love people, you're going to get hurt.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there's no way around it. You're going to get hurt. The option is not to don't love. The option is not to shut out. The option has to be, okay, I'm going to take this risk.
And I think that that's the other part of that, is that we have to consider the risk and the gain and decide that the gain, we're going to trust that the gain is going to be more, that it's going to be worth the risk of doing that again. Because, the people that you're talking about who you see that are struggling with those things that they can't seem to let go of, well, it's easy for us to say that on the outside of their lives, but I also believe that it's easier to see from the outside the things that they are giving up, that they don't even realize
that they're losing. Yeah,
that's right, because they haven't really considered, like, how much am I giving up to hold on to this thing? How much am I keeping myself from having? How many blessings in my life is God trying to give me that I'm constantly pushing away?
How long am I going to make this point?
Right.
Because what I don't want people to think is we're discounting hurt.
No.
People do get hurt, but you can't make that point for so long, right? You just can't. And at some point, you have to turn it over to God and allow the fence to be healed.
That's right.
Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue a conversation around the book of Genesis.